So this is in Mozambique. This is a combination of a bunch of different news stories, but they're all linked. So the first is from News 24. Just says Islamic State-linked insurgents attacked the town of Macoma in Mozambique's gas-rich Cabo Delgado province, according to people with the knowledge of the matter, in what is their boldest raid in more than 3 years. The violence is the latest string of attacks since December. And then this is from Religion Unplugged. Islamist extremists raging an insurgency in Mozambique have increasingly targeted Christians and church buildings in the first 3 months of the year. As a result, priests and their followers, a total of 100,000 people, have been forced to flee following increased attacks that have left scores of dead and some church buildings destroyed. The renewed attacks are coming at a time when the Mozambique government has been celebrating what it claimed to be a victory over the insurgency that has been raging in the northeastern Cabo Delgado province for the past 7 years. But since the beginning of the year, these terrorists have increased their attacks, making them more frequent and daring. And then in the first 3 weeks of February alone, these terrorists burned a total of 18 churches in 9 villages in the Chirua district. This is from the BBC. The illicit trade with China fueling Mozambique's insurgency. So timber smuggling, estimated to be worth $23 million a year in USD, from Mozambique's ancient forest to China, is helping fund a brutal Islamist insurgency, as well as a large criminal network in the north of the southern African country. The illicit trade in rosewood I said redwood in the intro, it's rosewood, is linked to the financing of Mozambique's Islamic State-linked militants in the northern province of Cabo Delgado, according to data seen by the BBC from the Environmental Investigation Agency, an NGO that campaigns against alleged environmental crime. Rosewood is a catch-all term for a wide range of tropical hardwoods that are highly prized for luxury furniture in Mozambique. Mozambique's rosewood is protected under an international treaty, meaning only very limited trade that does not threaten the species is allowed. But basically, an undercover investigation by the EIA revealed that because of corruption and illegal logging, trade has gone on consistently, particularly to China. So, as I mentioned earlier, corruption plays a big part in this. Some described it as a symbiotic relationship between Mozambique officials and the governing party. Mozambique has been a beneficiary of Chinese leader Xi Jinping's global infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative, for years, and sources said that the Frelimo Party gains legitimacy from attracting both Chinese business and large infrastructure investments and even campaign funds, and therefore is reluctant to criticize or crack down on wide-scale corrupt practices involving these players. So that's pretty much it. I skipped over a lot, but I'll put links to the full articles in the bio. But essentially, we've got Islamic insurgencies attacking Christian people in Mozambique, and because of Chinese rosewood trade, the government is both looking the other way, and this trade is helping fuel the Islamic insurgency's attacks. So, Philip, do you have any additional insight that you want to share with the audience?
Sure. Well, I think the one thing that stood out to me, I guess the first thing we're going to talk about is the religion aspect of this. And what's interesting to me is that we often hear things like religion has caused a lot of wars. And I think the situation is obviously a lot more complex in a lot of these cases, where you would have a practical political concern, which is here you have people who are insurgents who are fighting against the actual governing of the country. But then you also have this layer of religion. And I think it's a lot of the times it's not obvious which is the real cause. And sometimes, a lot of times people would use religion as a cover or as a motivating factor for other practical means. I think we talked about this in the previous episodes with Nigeria. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the religion doesn't then start to be like a secondary cause. So
Yeah, I'd say it like exacerbates it. It never like causes anything at the beginning. It's usually underlying cause, and religion is used as an excuse. But I do think the introduction of religion can sort of make the problem worse and perpetuate it.
exactly, I think like a lot of times it's not a starting cause, but it starts to actually maintain the conflict. And even when the starting cause and the original concerns are met, there's new concerns now which have been used in the escalation of the conflict in the first place.
I mean, what's interesting to me is, so you got China here, right? And we know what China's doing to Muslims in their own country, right? Detainment camps of upwards of 1 million, right? And often in horrible conditions. But here you see them allying with the Islamic insurgents.
Well, so first, the thing I'm not quite clear on in this story is how much is the Chinese government responsible for the rosewood trade as well. So I feel like I understand they're turning like one eye clearly to the trade because it's beneficial to the richer people in their society, but doesn't directly come from the Chinese government, does it? It's private individuals who are wanting to use for the furniture.
Well, my understanding is that the Chinese government has a pretty large presence in Mozambique. They mentioned the what was it, the Belt and
Road Initiative.
Belt and Road Initiative that Mozambique is benefiting from a lot, and they mentioned how the local officials in Mozambique and the government's ruling party wants to continue to have Chinese investment in the country, so they're purposely kind of turning a blind eye to
the redwood trade.
The redwood trade.
Rosewood.
I keep saying redwood, but it's rosewood.
Well, I think there's also another factor, which is that they're maybe not directly, but they're exerting political pressure on the government of Mozambique as well, because it said in the article that they don't want to upset the Chinese government by taking more serious measures to try and stop this. Right, so I think there is sort of it's obviously very indirect, and even the actual even in the articles it doesn't say exactly how they're getting this money. Like, so the insurgents, are they actually using, like, are they cutting down the trees? Are they like involved in this, or are they just allowing people to come in and then they're basically paid for protection of the land? So I think it's a very indirect way of doing it, where it's not obvious to what extent the actual government's involved. Right, in putting pressure on Mozambique.
Also, conscious of what I was saying, it is obviously the sort of upper class in China who are benefiting from buying the rosewood illegally. But I don't know if we can make a proper distinction between the government and the upper class in China. Gets quite blurry, in terms of plutocracy and all that. So,
meaning, generally the upper class in China tend to be buddy with the government.
Pretty much, there's a very strong marriage between corporation and state.
It is interesting too, the little detail that China itself bans rosewood trade, but they're perfectly happy to participate in it. Well, to me, what's clear is you're right. Even if it's not the Chinese government that is directly participating in this rosewood trade, to me, I'm probably 95% sure that they're aware of it's happening.
Yeah.
And they're choosing not to do anything about it.
Yeah, I would say probably. I mean, it doesn't seem like they're concerned about it to begin with, and it's probably beneficial for them to have it, right? So I don't think they're in any way. I mean, yeah, you say it's interesting that they proclaim that they're against it as a country, but obviously that's just, speech. It's not really any action that we see here.
I mean, is there any argument we can make here on behalf of Mozambique's government? Because Mozambique is, their economy right now is in shambles, right? And they're largely a victim of brutal colonial rule by the Portuguese. That has severely impacted, like, again, their economy. Portuguese were just stealing all the resources, And it's a country of like, don't quote me on this, but I want to say like somewhere between 38 and 70 million people. Like it's a very large country. And when you're a country that is not on the global, from a strategic perspective, right? When you're a country that you're not on a position to dictate the rules and dictate the way that the international economy is moving, you can make an argument that the strategy is you do have to be willing to play the game a little bit. And if you can get Chinese assistance with your economy by turning a blind eye to an illegal trade, then perhaps they're thinking, okay, well, what's the risk here? We're endangering a species, we're facilitating or we're not doing anything about a trade toward a severely endangered species, right? They said that the redwood is now the largest, the rosewood, sorry, is the largest illegally traded species in the world by a lot. And you're potentially helping fund Islamic militants. But at the same time, if you go too hard on China, then you're losing a key economic partner in your development. And so I'm just trying to think, is there any case we can make for the Mozambique government to maybe not do the exact same thing, but to be in a position where they're kind of, it's a lose-lose situation, right? Either they take drastic action against the Chinese government and against this trade, and they lose the Chinese investment, or they let it happen and have to deal with the Islamic insurgencies, but at the same time get support from the Chinese for investment.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult situation. I'd say that you can't really like blame them much for needing the Chinese support after, obviously Portuguese colonization they're going to obviously be a bit wary of the West. And I mean, I doubt the country would be in much better shape if the West were in place of China, to be honest. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, purely practically, if we're looking at what's like the West is basically talking here about like principles, but it's not really giving any practical solutions to this, whilst China's offering them business. So you can't really say anything against them, on a international scale. That's more important to a country like that. And it's just well, you said like how many million people live there. It's just hard to keep that many people in control, right, and not have insurgencies. So even if we don't talk about the government being involved in this, there's still the insurgents, right? So yeah, I agree. It's just it's a very complicated situation, and you can't really fault any of these practical decisions for the countries.
I mean, so to kind of go to the other side, what are the potential solutions that the West or other major countries could do? Because we've talked about not concerning the rosewood, but we've talked about Islamic insurgencies in various parts of Africa. What are the ways that you think that countries that are quote unquote Christian countries could do to prevent these insurgencies?
I mean, I don't know if they can prevent them because, as I said, I don't think the originating cause is always a religious one. So if we're talking about like practical matters, I also don't think that countries should get overly involved in other countries' business unless we're talking here about just diplomacy and business. So I don't have like a straight answer for what the West should give, But from the articles here that I've read, it doesn't offer anything, right? So that's
Right.
basically the main thing I'm taking away from this, is that Mozambique doesn't really have much of an option. And we can see that because even the insurgents who are against the government are also working in the trade of rosewood, right? So we see that clearly both sides cannot be that happy because both sides don't have control of the whole country. But they're both willing to go along with this trade because clearly it offers them enough solutions, right, for what they need. So I think you can see the importance of it for them if both sides are willing to go along with it, even though they know that their enemies in this case are also doing it, right? So maybe the West can offer something else that's and some sort of support against the insurgents, right, or something along those lines. But again, I don't know if what can be offered, and I don't know if it should be offered because I don't know that many details on the countries and what's actually going on there. But I think I'm staying consistent here with what I said on the previous one about Nigeria there as well. I thought that Christians should obviously talk more about these issues. They should be aware of these issues, and they should tell their governments about these issues, right, and actually try to bring the religion more into the culture instead of it just being locked away in some church, right?
I mean, there was another article that I didn't share, but it was interesting. It was talking about countries in West Africa and the role that Wagner and other private military companies, Russian private military companies, have had in those countries. And I did a paper last semester kind of looking at that. And if you look at most of the surveys within those countries, a lot of those people actually have very positive opinions of those private military companies for the sole reason that they are offering a level of security against these insurgents, these terrorist organizations, basically helping halt the violence against the civilians. So do either of you guys think that something similar to that could be a solution? Maybe not necessarily Russian private military companies, but is there a role for private military companies in general to play in helping halt these insurgencies?
Potentially. I mean, the track record for private military companies in doing stuff isn't great, but I mean, who else are you going to bring in? The UN peacekeepers, you know?
Yeah.
Their track record's even worse.
No, I agree. I mean, it's not ideal, obviously, but if we're talking about some sort of solutions, I think if you want to get involved, I think China and Russia are getting involved in the way that they can, in this sort of helpful way, but also obviously they're setting up their own like spheres of influence where they can actually, you know, dictate certain things in those countries. But it's a pretty clear strategy for a country to do that. It's in its own advantage. It's also to the advantage of the African countries. I mean, it did say here that Mozambique has accepted military aid from South Africa and Rwanda, I think. So there is some of that, but apparently it's not enough. It's not substantial enough to actually keep the northern part of the country.